Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Centralizing Clinical Trial Activities, Can This Be the New Norm? My name is Adriana Grotto, and I am a Business Development Representative at SDC, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Before I introduce our distinguished speakers for today, I will first cover a few webinar housekeeping tips. First, everyone has two audio options for listening in on today's webinar, computer audio or phone. If you hear any interference either on the phone or through your computer, the best way to troubleshoot is simply to switch to the other audio option. Please know that we are recording today's webinar and we will be sharing the recording with all registrants via email next week. We encourage you to share the recording with friends, colleagues, and anyone you feel would benefit from this webinar. Finally, if you have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, we do encourage you to communicate with us using the questions section of the webinar portal. If your question references a specific slide, please include that in your message. We should have about 15 minutes available at the end of the presentation for Q&A, and we'll do our best to address as many questions as possible within that time frame. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's webinar, Carrie Hamilton and Quan Doan. Carrie Hamilton is Director of Clinical Science at Styrus Research. Carrie brings over 25 years of biopharmaceutical experience with an expansive understanding of the industry, from product discovery and development to post-marketing patient access. Her global and therapeutic expertise, along with her patient-centric focus, bring incredible value to Styrus's clients. She has managed global programs with experience in medical affairs and evidence generation activities, as well as research projects. Quan Doan is Director of Technology Solutions at STC. He has over 19 years of experience in clinical data management and clinical programming experience. He currently manages our EDC Solutions and Clinical Programming Department here at STC. Quan specializes in clinical data management system selection, implementation, and software validation. He also has experience in software quality assurance. Quan has significant experience supporting technical and user experience development across different e-clinical technologies. Thank you again for tuning in for today's webinar. Remember, if you have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, please share those in the questions section of the webinar portal. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Carrie Hamilton and Quan Doan with Centralizing Clinical Trial Activities, Can This Be the New Norm?
That's great. Thank you, Adriana. We are looking forward to speaking with you all today about this topic. As Adriana explained, for this talk, we will be focusing on the success and challenges we face while expanding our virtual world to include as many operational activities as we can. We will be examining those activities and discuss challenges and identify some key tips on how you would go about planning to move forward with centralized monitoring. I would like to start by defining what we mean when we are referring to centralized monitoring. We realize that due to some of the site restrictions we have recently been faced with, this is a topic of great interest. While there is a need to have the perfect easy fix for ongoing studies where processes need to move to a centralized or remote capacity, this was not the initial intent of our webinar. We are aware that the current situation has increased the focus of centralized monitoring, so we do see an increasing interest to plan our future studies with more centralized capabilities. Centralized monitoring is a remote evaluation carried out by sponsor personnel or their representatives at a location other than the sites. These processes can provide many of the capabilities of on-site monitoring, but in addition, by identifying the proper function to be responsible for different activities, we are able to perform more activities than we did when we were confined to review data only at the site. While there have already been a lot of activities being taken away from the site, this is still a paradigm shift from the traditional monitoring environment. We are tipping the scales to rely more heavily on innovative technologies and pre-planning work in order to ensure the success of moving more activities remotely. Centralized monitoring and other activities allow us to spend more time examining the information and data throughout a study instead of waiting for specific analysis points to identify trends, see early responses, and to mitigate risk. We feel it is important to identify the difference from centralized monitoring to another hot topic, that of decentralized clinical trials, or the concept of the virtual site. In the case of decentralized clinical trials, this is where you are removing certain to all activities which affect how the patient may be enrolled in a study and how they go through their assessments while participating in a study. It is expanding the site to allow an increase in recruitment potential and to realize that the patient does not necessarily need to be on site for the collection of data for a study. In order to discuss the planning and execution of the virtual site, we would need to schedule a whole new webinar. So for this talk, we will be focusing on the planning of shifting operational and monitoring activities away from the site. Can clinical trials be fully centralized? I would like to open this presentation up to a poll to allow all the participants to answer this question. On your screen, you will simply click on yes or no. We will give you all a few seconds to make your selection. Based on your definition, on our definition of centralized monitoring, do you think clinical trials can be fully centralized? Is it a possibility for the future? And can it be effective? So we'll have the results up on the screen shortly to see what you've all chosen. So we have 62% of you who have indicated that this may not be possible. Perhaps there are limitations that you are aware of or that you're thinking of right now and barriers that are preventing us from being able to go fully centralized. Most likely, this may not be the possible strategy for all types of clinical trials, but there may be some where we may be able to overcome some of those limitations. Think about this question as we go through the rest of the presentation, as we will be coming back to this question at the end of the discussion to give you an opportunity to see if your opinion has changed. In order to determine the amount or level of centralized activities for a particular study, we would need to define what those activities are and know the availability and level of access we have to data within the systems at the sponsor or the study level and at the site level. Regulations are not preventing us from planning for more centralized activities, but are actually encouraging us to evaluate the innovative systems that are available to allow for greater remote access to data. ICH Section E6 was revised in November 2016 to address the emerging use of electronic data sources and the increase of different risk management processes. Next year, we are expecting another revision, which will further encourage the use of new innovative technologies and trial designs in a risk-based approach. This new revision will have a section for interventional clinical trials and a separate for non-interventional studies, including those which incorporate real-world data sources. Now, Kwan will examine the activities which have already been successfully centralized.
Thanks, Carrie. So as Carrie mentioned, we've already kind of moved into this centralized arena in certain aspects, given the current landscape of the pandemic that's going on right now. Some of these items have been pushed to the forefront, if you will. So I'll go over some of the common activities that have been centralized successfully, and then we'll go over some not so common ones that have started to wet our lips a little bit, but we'll dive into those as we go deeper into the presentation. So the idea of electronic data capture, right? This has been a paradigm shift since the early 2000s. We have technology that enables us to capture data remotely, right? Whether it's through an ECRF or ePRO systems, as well as IRT. And a lot of it is, shifting the notion that, everything needs to be on site to having things on mobile devices, right, for ePROs and having that be remote already. The notion of risk-based monitoring, right? That's been a hot topic for the last handful of years, as Carrie mentioned, with everyone getting a better understanding of the guidances from the agencies and regulatory bodies. We've seen that major shift from reduction of 100% SDV to something more reduced, and we've seen various approaches to that, right? Whether it's been from the onset, understanding how your clinical landscape is, or your trial landscape is looking, and implementing that from the beginning. And we've also seen that implemented midstream, right, where typically you see something like a shift from full SDV up until your primary endpoint to maybe something more reduced or risk-based as we go into long-term follow-up studies or portions of your trials. And the key there, right, I think we've seen from the agency is as long as the team has a robust monitoring plan and have defined, the strategy up front, as well as any risk mitigation activities up front, that's been successfully done over the last couple of years. Another notion that has come up partly due to risk-based monitoring is this notion of centralized data review. Right, taking a step back and looking at the data more holistically, right? SDV, SDR is just one component of monitoring activities, but taking a step back and looking at the data through a different lens, and technology enables us to do that. So if you look at the current technology landscape, there's a lot more visualization tools out there. The idea of big data has gone up over the last couple of years, and so those tools combined with the risk-based monitoring approach, right, having us define those key performance indicators and those key risk indicators up front, allows the monitors and the CRAs to step away from the site a little bit and get that bigger picture view. In conjunction with that centralized and holistic data review piece of it, right, the ability for EDCs to have more robust designs, whether it's through dynamic forms and fields or an increase in the number of edit checks or the ability to program more complex checks, right, as these new EDC systems come out, allows us to have cleaner data coming in. The premise of garbage in, garbage out hopefully goes away because we can leverage these technologies to our benefit. If you have those edit checks designed up front appropriately, right, you may significantly reduce the need for SDV because those live edit checks will help govern that. We've seen the advent of remote site training increase as well, right? Whether it's from a technology standpoint, whether EDCs have built-in e-learning modules or not, right, for role-based training. We've also seen an increase in LMSs in the world, right? So there's no reason why, and we've successfully done this, right? Developing protocol-specific training either as an e-learning module or creating a whole separate training class, if you will, in our LMSs and deploying those remotely, reducing the need for that initial site initiation visit to be based on fully training the site. And then the notion of electronic data documentation collection, right? Again, lots of technologies in place now, whether it's eTMF, document file sharing portals. We've seen lots of clients and sponsors have their own electronic data repositories to reduce the need to send things via email or have to go out to the sites, right, to provide that regulatory binder initially. Some other not so common activities, but as we mentioned earlier, that we're shifting to these paradigms, whether it's due to the current pandemic or others, just being a more virtualized world in general. So the idea of virtual investigator meetings, those have been going on a little bit more frequently nowadays with COVID and site initiation visits, but that's always kind of been there, right? If you think about repeat sites where you have familiarity with them, there hasn't always been a need to be on site for those initiations. Again, taking more of a risk-based approach and looking at who we've worked with in the past, our comfort level, identifying low risk sites or ones that we can do these things remotely, but then still going on site for those high risk identified sites. So we can look at how we can potentially change that and possibly do high risk sites remotely as well. I mentioned on the previous slide, right, with eTMF, again, a lot of folks are going to the idea of the centralized eTMF platform, and those eTMF providers um, also understand that and have oftentimes developed additional site portals, right? So not just having the requirement for the sites to use the eTMF platform for the sponsor, but also allowing them to manage their own documentation, whether or not it's related to the clinical trial, in their own electronic platform other than an EMR. And so the notion of having those site modules attached to those eTMFs makes it easier for everyone involved. And we're seeing a slight uptick in the usage of those site portals as well. E-consents is something that's been around for the last couple of years. I think it's been a little bit slower on the uptake than we would have liked to see. Again, I think as Carrie mentioned earlier, it's more of a paradigm shift. And so getting folks and the ability to have that dialogue, right? Usually when you're sitting in front of an investigator trying to, you know, give consent, there's times for Q&As and questions. And so, some of the e-consent platforms out there don't necessarily have that additional capability just yet. It's really just here's your document and sign it. And so working through that and making sure that everyone involved is more comfortable with that e-consent process. Access to EMRs. We talk about electronic data and big data. There's been this pitch that several years ago, I remember folks saying that there would be an EMR standard out that would be available and that we could harmonize EMR to EDC data. I think that's still in the works. It hasn't come quite as far as I think folks had hoped, but we're starting to see that sites are beginning to allow CRAs and external staff to remotely access the EMR. A lot of the concerns have been around access levels, right? And patient confidentiality. So, as sites upgrade their infrastructures and upgrade their EMRs, there has been the ability to limit the scope of and access to those EMRs to the appropriate levels for CRAs to do their jobs. And so we'll discuss that more later on in the presentation as well. The idea of virtual evaluation of assessments, right? I think Carrie mentioned this as part of the decentralized clinical trials. The advent of ePro and those and eCOA technologies, but you also have the notion of telemedicine and how can that work itself into certain types of assessments, right, away from the sites. The notion of wearable technologies, I think everyone has jumped on that bandwagon at one point or another, right? With everyone with their Apple Watches and their Fitbits, Garmin devices, capturing a lot of that data remotely. It's really another type of e-source, if you will. And usually the premise behind that is, okay, we have all of this data. We can't really source verify that, but what are we going to do with it moving forward? What data and how can we analyze that, and what's actually usable for clinical trials comes up often as a question around those. And last but not least, the notion of e-source. Again, I think every year when folks go to DIA and the larger conferences, e-source is something that is heavily looked at in the market currently, with the notion of shifting the responsibilities, right, away from having to have source documentation and transcription into CRFs, thereby possibly reducing the need for actual SDV period, right? But I think there's still that initial concern of how do you review that data appropriately, right? And you still needing to do SDR in the absence of SDV. So, at the end of the day, there's still lots of activities that we're not quite used to it yet. We're seeing an uptick of those, but these are key in evaluating the capabilities of centralizing up clinical operation activities for a clinical study. As we mentioned earlier, we've seen some things that have been successful to date. Looking at the early implementation of centralized monitoring, where we've evaluated and we've worked with Styrus and others to determine, where can we reduce these on-site activities. And to date, I think most folks again have seen that switch from away from primary endpoint to that long-term follow-up, right? When patients are off of their investigational product. So therefore drug has been reconciled. And so that gives, I think, everyone those warm, fuzzy feelings to be more comfortable with the idea of having to go out on site less, right? It's not as critical of a data point for that long-term follow-up versus that primary endpoint. And so, that being said, we saw, about 38% earlier in the presentation saying that they think we can go there. So I'm sure your teams have seen success early on in this idea of centralized monitoring as well. So with that, I will transition this back to Carrie to go over additional current challenges to centralizing activities.
Thanks, Kwan. We know that challenges exist, which currently prevent us from effectively centralizing some activities. Depending on the study and the planning, we may be able to overcome these limitations. Hopefully, if new challenges arise, which may not be covered in these slides, the process for evaluating and overcoming the limitations may be transferable. Since we are looking at fully centralized monitoring as a paradigm shift away from our traditional methods, we have to evaluate how this affects all parties involved. We have to go back in time to remember what it was like when we were shifting away from paper CRFs and quality of life questionnaires. Some of you may not remember that, but perhaps you have some colleagues that you can actually rely on to ask that question. The current infrastructure may need to be updated, which would also mean an upfront investment of time and money to implement new systems and processes. For the most part, the systems already exist, which can allow an increase with centralized activities. They just may not be part of the current infrastructure at the site or considered during early planning stages of a study. I'm very aware that there are many companies who are developing and have developed effective systems which can be easily implemented and adapted for a particular study or at the site level. The initial investment to ensure that we have effective systems and processes in place may require a shift in the cost of development. What will need to be spent now may, in the end, be saved in other aspects, whether it be travel resources, transcription errors, delays with getting endpoint data, etc. When looking at what activities are going to be centralized, we need to fully evaluate the regulatory requirements within all of the regions and countries where the study will be conducted, especially pertaining to data privacy and GDPR practices. We also have to acknowledge the strain we may be putting on site staff and study personnel with the implementation of new systems and new processes to get used to. With so many different systems out there, sites who are participating in multiple trials concurrently will end up using a wide array of systems. Even at the sponsor level, when we have used multiple different systems in different studies, this can become overwhelming to ensure that we are kept up to date on the training, capabilities, and processes within each system, not to mention the different user IDs and passwords. Earlier, Kwan mentioned that there have been some successful transitions to centralized monitoring, but typically after all subjects are no longer on investigational product. Drug reconciliation, for the most part, has been an on-site activity. However, processes could be implemented and systems used to allow for partial or full reconciliation of drug remotely. We could evaluate the use of accessible systems or shareable logs to get a current snapshot of the inventory, dispensing, and return or destruction of the investigational product at the site level. There have also been the use of bar-coded systems applied to the packaging or labeling of the product, and also the use of tear-off labels, which can easily be added to sheets of paper and scanned and copied for remote accessibility. An additional process that can be implemented, which we have been evaluating recently, is the capability of direct-to-patient shipping of investigational product from a central depot. Of course, this cannot be done for products requiring on-site preparation and administration, but this can be quite effective for products which are self-administered by the subject. As you can imagine, this can be valuable to set up when there are current restrictions for subjects to get on-site. Often we have seen that sponsor or CRO SOPs have specific requirements to conduct on-site facility review when qualifying the site during site selection and pre-study, especially if it has been over 1 year since the last visit, or it's with a new principal investigator or a different therapeutic area in the same site. While there may be good value to have an in-person evaluation, we have found with recent on-site restrictions during the COVID-19 pandemic, we have found other innovative ways to trust a site remotely and by implementing a few of these techniques for site qualification visits. You would need to evaluate what current communication tools are available to the sponsor and the site to effectively get the qualification information needed at pre-study and ongoing during the conduct of the trial. Other techniques include the use of video conferencing or video chats or pre-recorded site virtual tours. Other challenges are related to situational aspects. With regards to timing, when you are looking to implement a centralized, when are you looking to implement a centralized activity or an aspect of remote monitoring? A change in the protocol or a situation may require a change in the process. If you don't already know what your limitations are, it may be difficult to plan for centralized monitoring or activity during the conduct of the study. With current opinions, we understand that there may not be a collective level of comfort or confidence that we can still be effective in a remote capacity. There may not be a full understanding of the systems we have and what they are capable of doing. While technology innovation grows, it may still be a limitation. There are no industry standards for common electronic systems with regards to e-consent, e-source, eTMF, and with a wide variety of EMRs available at the site, we are not able to have a consistent remote accessibility across our sites. The good news is that many of the new systems are able to read to and from each other, making accessibility a lot easier, but we still have to evaluate every system individually to see if an activity or an aspect of monitoring can be fully centralized. Are sites ready for centralized monitoring? On-site restrictions during the COVID-19 situation has allowed us to reach out to many sites to collect insights on how they feel about remote monitoring and what their current challenges may be. This was not an official survey. It is just a gathering of information from sites who are currently participating in studies. I would also like to point out that the sites that we had approached were already on ongoing studies, which were not initially designed to have remote capabilities implemented. In the next two slides, we have provided a snapshot of some of the responses. Highlighted in yellow, you will see some of the main limitations we are faced with. Many sites are still getting used to remote visits without adding an aspect of SDV in that remote visit. Some examples are that it's too great of a risk to patient information. The EMR might only be a portion of the source available at the site. Remote monitoring just takes up more time for the site staff, and we are limited on how much data we can provide per visit. On the next slide, there are some more examples. You will require additional vetting and signing off for confidential data provided in a different manner. Remote accessibility is limited for a specific period of time, and remote monitoring will only be allowed during the pandemic. On a positive note, One site, highlighted in blue on the slide, stated that no policies are currently preventing them from implementing remote monitoring or the transmission of redacted data. However, in this particular case, they just didn't have the right system in place to allow for remote access. In many of these cases, the infrastructure or processes are not currently in place to fully embrace the centralized monitoring environment. If they don't currently have the systems in place, where would they get the funding to ensure their site is capable of allowing for remote access? That's another big question that we will be faced with. I do believe in time, these are challenges that can be evaluated and overcome to allow an increase in centralized activities. Many sites are already making necessary changes to increase the capabilities of remote monitoring and SDV. During recent feasibility, we have identified many sites who have the infrastructure in place, and we are starting to see an increase in remote monitoring SOPs, which include how to access their EMR systems remotely or implement other processes to ensure the continued remote review of source data. Now Quan will show us how we move forward with planning centralized activities.
Thanks, Carrie. So, we've already discussed some things that folks have successfully done over the last handful of years, some challenges that we, possibly face, and I think Carrie gave some good pointers on how to get around those, right? But at the end of the day, planning is essential. And so, as we look at, again, looking at this from a early feasibility standpoint, right? So really trying to implement this upfront and not midstream in a study. We do need to look and perform a risk-benefit analysis of the study design and understand, how we can look at that data and review critical data effectively. So that does, require the involvement of your extended teams, right? Not just on the operational side, but also involving data management and your statistical teams, right? So understanding that, if we reduce SDV or SDR here, how does that impact our critical data and our final analysis? Is that something that we can mitigate in a different manner? But having that discussion upfront with your teams. To evaluate that, right? We know that not all trials can be centralized, but that requires the team to put their heads together and evaluate. During the site selection or qualification process, that may require just building in additional questions, right? So to the point that Carrie mentioned earlier, not everyone has the infrastructure in place, but how do you know if you don't ask the right questions during those qualification visits? Does the site have the ability to allow you access to those EMRs or EHRs? Do they have an electronic repository for the regulatory documents, whether it's an eTMF site portal or some other mechanism that they can share with you? And also ensuring that, both their internal processes, as Carrie mentioned, doesn't conflict with the ability to move things remotely, right? Again, we're seeing an uptick in flexibility there due to the current pandemic. But again, right, you may end up with hospitals or bigger, larger institutions who aren't as nimble when it comes to process updates. And so, usually that's where we see, their IT team, will have lots of questions for us and want to make sure that, accessibility is done in an appropriate manner or limit access therein. And a lot of the discussion today is focused on our sites, right? That's primarily where we're doing most of our work in relation to centralized activities. But another key aspect is looking at your other vendors, right? So, if you think about central laboratories and how they send data, um, imaging core labs, right? Imaging vendors, do their systems also have the ability to allow for external access? I think a lot of times we we focus on the site so much that we forget about all of these other ancillary vendors that are out there, and understanding what their systems are capable of, because they are still, in essence, a key aspect of source. And so understanding their systems and their limitations and their processes will also be key in identifying whether or not we can fully centralize that trial or not. Again, the key thing here, we mentioned it early on in the presentation, is defining the strategy in your monitoring plan, right? Um, you know, with the uptick in risk-based monitoring, um, or, whether it's a fully centralized or a hybrid approach where we limit the amount of on-site access that we need, that all needs to be defined up front. The regulations, as Carrie mentioned, don't inhibit us from doing that. They just call out the need for us to be cognizant of what we're doing and stick to that plan, right? Um, the idea of risk-based approach, again, I think folks have commonly and successfully done this to date. Again, involving your scientific and stats teams to identify key study parameters, identifying those key metrics that you want to look at, and understanding, you know, that it's okay to not have 100% SDV, but you're still performing your reviews in a different manner, whether it's through central data review or other means. Um, Again, once you've identified all of your risks, you do need to come up with a risk mitigation strategy. So, because we are reducing the ability to perform on-site visits, or looking to reduce those, what other technologies can we leverage um, to mitigate those risks? And what does the escalation plan look like when those risks are occurring? Again, ensuring, that you still are performing SDV. I think a lot of non-clinical operations teams interchange SDR and SDV. Um, and part of that is an education process and letting them understand that, again, going back to the notion of that comfort level, it's not that your data is not being looked at, right? So SDR is still needing to happen. Um, but SDV is where you're reducing your data reviews, and that's in a lot of folks' mind is more of like your data entry QC, right? You already have your source data. You're just verifying that it was entered into EDC correctly and that nothing was missed from that perspective. And again, with the notion of eSource, some folks are already using that, but remembering that that does impact your monitoring strategy, right? So, are you double dipping if you have eSource and still perform SDV? What are you looking for? That's really SDR. So again, getting the semantics correct around that and making sure that your entire study teams understand what we're trying to do moving forward. The other major aspect of this is technology, right? So looking at, as Carrie mentioned, understanding what your systems are capable of. I think a lot of times we implement systems for certain key functionality, and we forget that there are all these other ancillary aspects of these systems. And at the end of the day, we're really only using, maybe 30 to 40% of their capabilities. Um, Leverage your data management and biostatistics teams when it comes to EDC development, right? A lot of EDC systems out there these days have the ability for uploading files. Um, so, you can transfer data in that method to allow for remote SDV possibly if, if you can't get access to EMR. A lot of the KPIs, you know, performance indicators, risk indicators, there are lots of RBM systems that are available out in the market. A lot of them you can also perform utilizing your current EDC technology. So understanding, what they can do, and going to those system SMEs to ask the right questions, can often help with trying to centralize activities. Um, CTMS is another common one. We've seen that really kept to usually the owning organization of the CTMS, typically ClinOps or the sponsors. There's no reason why we can't expand access to that, right? A lot of these systems have role-based security. So, you know, tracking of, expiring IRB approvals and other document updates, that can be handled both in the CTMS as well as in the eTMF platforms as well. So again, work with those key team members to understand that, you know, again, Carrie mentioned we have lots of technology, we see it there, and instead of looking for the next best thing, look internally, right? There's a lot of marketing firms out there and a lot of new systems that are out in the market every year. But a lot of times your current systems are also evolving, and you can leverage them without incurring huge costs in terms of implementing a new system. And again, the key thing here is the ability to integrate, right? The idea of big data, data lakes, and data warehouses. Um, you know, a lot of teams have successfully integrated CTMS to eTMF, right? As we get expiring dates of key milestones and things of that nature, those are push notifications to those eTMF site portals for them to upload, their annual CV updates or new documentation or new IRB approvals. So a lot of it again is planning around that and understanding, what you have and what you can work with. And I hope that has helped folks think a little bit outside of the box, and think about leveraging what they currently have in order to move to more centralized activities. So with that, I'm going to hand this back over to Carrie.
Yep. Great, thanks again. So here we are again with this question that we proposed to you at the beginning of the webinar. I again open this up to allow everyone to answer the question. Again, it's going to be a yes or no question for, can clinical trials be fully centralized? Now that you have had time to hear about some of the activities we could centralize and how we may be able to overcome some of the current limitations and challenges, do you think it would be possible for a study, not necessarily all studies, to be fully centralized? We do hope that we have been able to show you that there has been a lot of advancement of technology and processes to allow for different kinds of monitoring strategies. With the right systems and processes in place, planning for fully centralized monitoring might be a possibility. So we'll just wait for the results. And I'm very happy to see that there has been an increase, up to 56% of you that do feel that clinical trials can be centralized. Earlier on, it was 38%. So I do acknowledge that there is still a percentage who do not think this is a possibility. And there could still be some activities which may prevent us from performing it remotely or in a central location. However, with how fast technology is growing, today's challenges may be solved in the near future. So what does the future of clinical trials look like? So for the future, over the years, we have seen a progression of more activities being centralized, and current events are a clear sign that we will need to be prepared to know the capability to shift more activities to a centralized manner. Now that we realize the importance to be ready, we may still need to approach centralized monitoring in a very situational perspective and understand that not all processes fit all designs or studies. As we are still getting comfortable with less than 100% SDV and increasing remote visits, we need to see more examples of the success of centralization. What we are doing now during the pandemic are quick fixes, and while they're allowable, we wonder, are they really sustainable? We may not be there yet, but I do see us moving in this direction, having a more hybrid approach, but shifting the scales to increase remote capabilities. Evaluating the level of centralized monitoring will be the new norm. I don't want to diminish the great importance to early study planning to identify how we can increase centralized activities. An evaluation of the study design and key objectives are required to ensure that the data to support key parameters of the study can be reviewed completely and confidently in a remote capacity. It is important that there needs to be an investment of time and money to choose the right system and identify the right process and personnel to perform specific activities remotely. Our planning checklists need to be updated to not only ask the questions, but to ensure that if you're choosing to have specific things performed centrally, you are aware upfront of the abilities available to you at the site in order to be able to conduct the study. The key takeaways for this webinar is really about how essential it is to plan. Evaluate the study, the site, and the systems to be used and know if any limitations or potential challenges exist in the guidelines and policies in all regions. You need to know if any limitations exist up front and plan accordingly, either to mitigate them, develop a monitoring plan around the capabilities, and to determine what the escalation plan will look like. To succeed, we need to embrace the innovative technologies that are available, evaluate the clinical trial design, and if necessary, update any policies or processes. As Benjamin Franklin stated, failing to plan is planning to fail. And with that final note, we are happy to pass this back over to Adriana to open things up for some questions.
Thank you, Quan and Carrie. At this moment, we'll allow time for Q&A. Thank you to those of you who have already sent in some questions. For those of you who would still like to submit one, remember you can share the questions in the question section of the webinar portal, which is to the right of your screen, and we're going to do the best we can to answer as many as we can in the next couple of 10 minutes here. So we'll get started with the first question. What can we do for IMP administration, training device, or sub-Q injections?
So I think I can take this one. We realize that there's a lot of different administrations, preparations, requirements, not just from IMP, but some specific assessments that do require some almost hands-on training. And in those cases, there has been some success of using videos where you might have a specific trainer videotape what the requirements are. There have been video chats or video teleconferencing so you can see the implementation of the training on site. In some cases, this is maybe a situation where the study may, or the assessment or the administration for the IMP might require a specific representation from the study team on site in order to do the training or not. So this is a case that maybe all studies may not be fully capable of being remote, but there are definitely some ways of getting around it for some training. And keep in mind, if you do have some training that's videoed, and recorded, this is an opportunity for if there's new site staff that need to be trained moving forward throughout the conduct of the study.
Great. Another question. Document through a system when you don't have EMR access.
Sorry, Adriana, that question cut out. Could you repeat that?
Sure. What are examples of privately sharing source documents securely through a system when you don't have EMR access?
Okay. So I think I can take this one from a technology side. This is a fun one that we've seen work through this current pandemic landscape is it does require a little bit of extra work on the sites, but it does require the team to scan source documents, but there are a lot of file transfer applications out there, right? Common ones that we've seen that are secure are something like box.com. Folks have used, if they're using Office 365, they've used their OneDrives, because you can limit access to certain recipients of that information. And a key question that we get from folks on that, in addition, is, as they're uploading, those scanned source documents, what about the ability to redact information, right? So with the privacy laws in place and PHI and GDPR, among others, um, a lot of it, I think, comes down to role-based security and who's accessing that data. Um, so if you think about it, when monitors or CRAs go on site, they are technically already exposed to PHI, right? Those source documents aren't always de-identified. And so if you limit access to that individual file or those file transfer applications, to those roles, then inherently, you're kind of in the same boat, right? So if you're only limiting access to the coordinators as well as the CRAs, then there may not need the requirement to redact that information. But again, I think that's getting people's comfort level up to par with that the security is in place within those applications.
Thank you, Kwan. Another question here. Can all EDC systems allow for scanning attached source documents?
So I'll take that one as well. It's similar to the last question. Um, so I can't go out on a limb and say all EDC systems have the ability to upload documents, but there are quite a few, right? I think we mentioned that earlier. So again, once you understand your EDC technology, I would say that the majority of them do have the ability to upload documents. There may be some file size limitations um, that come with your platform. I think some limit it to 100 megabytes per file, others limit it to 5 or 10 megabytes per file. And that's why working with your data management teams and your EDC provider will help, right? So understanding what those file size limitations are and how you want to configure the EDC platform to accept and what document types are allowable. Now, that being said, there are some EDC platforms out there that do have the ability to redact information upon upload. So for example, you can upload the file before it's stored in the system. A redaction screen comes up, basically like a black highlighter. You can black out all the items that you need to, and that blacked out rendering is what is loaded into the system. And the benefit to utilizing your EDC system is that it's already role-based, right? And so you do, maybe have less administrative concerns if you leverage your EDC platform for that versus utilizing a third-party file transfer portal.
Great. We have another question here. How do you go about encouraging a site towards accepting the centralized process?
Yes, since it's relative to the site, I'll answer this one. I think we're already talking about this at the sites, or it's already out there. I don't want to say thanks to a pandemic out there that's increasing the need for speaking about these things. But it is, we are seeing the value of the need to be flexible and have the capabilities and to utilize the systems that are already existing out there, and to be able to have that ability when we are restricted from going on site. So because we're already talking about it, there already might be an easier way of having that discussion to see what do we do when we're now moving forward. Start having the discussions now with some of the sites and during feasibility for when we're planning these new studies now to say, what are the capabilities? What can we do? And even, speaking from the CRO perspective, when we're speaking with sponsors, have these it's an opportunity to discuss what other systems that they may not be aware of, or other vendors that they may not be aware of, to encourage the use of increasing systems and increasing other functions to be able to take some of the burden of the data review. It may be it may be slow in some situations. There's a lot of processes to overcome. But eventually, I don't see very many studies out there now using a paper CRF. So eventually it may just become the norm of, is there a way of doing something centralized or not? And is that going to be the best way to collect the data or to review the data? So I think eventually it will just be the way that we are evaluating how we're evaluating the studies and having discussions with the sites. So it still may be slow with some sites, but I think we're moving in the right direction to have those discussions now.
Thank you, Carrie. We are coming up on the hour now, so for those of you whose questions we did not get to, our panelists will be responding in follow-up. Quan, Carrie, again, thank you both. We will be sending a recording of this webinar to all registered participants. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. We hope you enjoyed the webinar and found the content helpful. And with that, we are going to conclude today's webinar.